On March 31, 1922, 6 people living on a remote farm in Bavaria, Germany, were brutally murdered. More than a century later, nobody knows who committed the crime. But what makes this case truly terrifying is what happened before the killings. The farm, known as Hinterkaifeck, stood isolated in the countryside, surrounded by fields and forest. The nearest neighbors lived nearly a kilometer away. It was the kind of place where a scream could disappear into the darkness without anyone hearing it. Days before the murders, the family began noticing signs that someone else might already be living on their property. The farm was home to Andreas Gruber, his wife Cäzilia, their widowed daughter Viktoria, Viktoria's 2 children, and the family's maid. They lived a quiet rural life, largely cut off from the outside world. A few days before the murders, Andreas noticed something unusual. Fresh footprints appeared in the snow leading from a nearby forest directly to the farm. What disturbed him most was that there were no footprints leading back out again. The tracks suggested that someone had arrived at the property but never left. Andreas searched the area but found nothing. He mentioned the strange discovery to neighbors, but nobody could explain it. Soon after, Andreas discovered a newspaper inside the house that nobody recognized. No member of the family had purchased it, and nobody knew how it had gotten there. Then another strange event occurred. A set of house keys suddenly went missing. The family searched everywhere but never found them. If someone had taken the keys, they could have moved freely throughout every building on the property. Around the same time, family members began hearing footsteps coming from the attic during the night. Andreas investigated repeatedly, but every search ended the same way. Nobody was found. Yet the sounds continued, as though someone was moving around directly above their heads. The unexplained events became so unsettling that the family's maid quit her job. She reportedly believed the farm was haunted and refused to stay any longer. Her decision would ultimately save her life. She left only hours before a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived to take her place. On the evening of March 31st, neighbors noticed that the farm seemed unusually quiet. There were no lights, no activity, and no signs of movement. But in a rural community where families often kept to themselves, nobody thought much of it. No one realized that a nightmare was already unfolding behind the farm's doors. Investigators later concluded that the killer likely began by luring members of the family one by one into the barn. The exact method remains unknown. Perhaps they heard a suspicious noise. Perhaps they were called outside by someone they trusted. Whatever happened, they entered willingly. Andreas Gruber was attacked first. He was struck repeatedly with a farming tool known as a mattock. The blows were devastating. One after another, other members of the family entered the barn and met the same fate. The killer appeared to be patient, waiting in the darkness as each victim unknowingly walked into a deadly trap. Viktoria, her mother Cäzilia, and 7-year-old Cäzilia were all murdered inside the barn. Evidence later suggested that young Cäzilia survived for several hours after the attack. Investigators discovered strands of her own hair clutched tightly in her hands, indicating that she had torn it out in pain and distress while lying wounded. After killing the 4 victims in the barn, the murderer entered the farmhouse itself. There, 2-year-old Joseph and the newly arrived maid Maria Baumgartner were killed in separate rooms. By the end of the night, every person living on the farm was dead. Most killers flee immediately after committing such a crime. The Hinterkaifeck murderer apparently did the opposite. Evidence suggests that the killer remained on the property for days after the murders had taken place. Neighbors later reported seeing smoke rising from the chimney. The farm's animals were fed and cared for. Someone appeared to be maintaining the property as though nothing had happened. Yet every member of the household was already dead. Whoever stayed behind not only felt comfortable on the farm, but seemed familiar with its daily routines and responsibilities. Several days later, concerned neighbors decided to investigate. When they entered the property, they were met with a horrifying scene. The bodies of 4 family members were discovered stacked inside the barn. The remaining victims were found elsewhere in the house. News of the massacre spread quickly throughout the region. Soon, investigators, journalists, and curious onlookers flooded the scene. Unfortunately, this was 1922. Modern forensic science did not exist, and the crime scene became contaminated almost immediately. Valuable evidence that might have identified the killer was unknowingly destroyed. As investigators searched for answers, several theories emerged. One possibility was robbery. However, money and valuables were left behind. Nothing of significant value appeared to have been taken. If theft was the motive, why would the killer ignore easily accessible cash and remain on the property afterward? The behavior simply did not fit. The killer seemed less interested in stealing and more focused on the family itself. This led investigators to believe that the murders may have been deeply personal. Another theory centered on revenge. Andreas Gruber was known locally as a difficult and often abusive man. Over the years, he had developed conflicts with various people in the area. Investigators examined acquaintances, neighbors, former workers, and family connections. Some suspected a former farmhand who had once worked at Hinterkaifeck. Others believed the killer may have been someone the family knew well. Yet despite years of investigation and countless interviews, no suspect could ever be conclusively linked to the murders. Among all the theories, one remains the most disturbing. Some investigators believe the killer may have been secretly living in the attic before the murders ever took place. The mysterious footprints, the missing keys, the unfamiliar newspaper, and the unexplained footsteps overhead all seem to point toward the same terrifying possibility. If true, it would mean the murderer was hiding above the family while they ate meals, worked, and slept below, quietly observing them for days or even weeks before finally striking. Over the decades, police reopened the investigation multiple times. Hundreds of suspects were examined, and modern criminal profilers reviewed the surviving evidence. Despite every effort, no suspect could ever be definitively identified. Today, the Hinterkaifeck farm no longer exists. The buildings were demolished years after the murders, leaving little trace of the place where the tragedy occurred. Yet the mystery remains. Did a stranger emerge from the forest and never leave? Was someone secretly hiding in the attic? Or did the killer live among the family long before the murders began? More than 100 years later, Hinterkaifeck still refuses to reveal its secrets. If you enjoy mysteries, unsolved crimes, and hidden history, subscribe to Unsealed. Some secrets were buried for a reason.